Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another interview on the Art of Intervention Project Summit. Real excited to interview Dr. Rob Weiss. We've spent some time together before, and very impactful. He's often referenced in other podcast interviews I do from people that are extremely familiar with him. He is changing lives around the globe. So, Dr. Weiss, you want to go ahead and explain maybe kind of who are you? How do you introduce yourself?
Well, I think Dr. Rob is a good one. I'm a sexologist. I have a PhD in sex, so I speak sex, and I've worked with a lot of couples who have infidelity and sexual issues. But I've worked in the addiction field most of my life. I mean, I've written 10 books. I've opened and created about 4 or 5 treatment centers, and really all related to my own healing and recovery. Lots of meetings, lots of therapy, lots of hard work. Yeah, that's a little bit about me. I live in Los Angeles. I'm happily married. I have a good dog. Things are good.
It's a beautiful background you have there as well. I know you live in a beautiful part of the country.
This is where I live. I take a picture every morning of where I am, and whatever Zoom stuff I do, you can see where I am. And sometimes it's cloudy, sometimes it's sunny. You know, it is what it is. But thanks. We pay to live in California.
Yes, I hear you do pay to live in California. So they're starting to charge us.
I deserve a view for what I'm paying.
Yeah, they're starting to charge us a little more in Denver too, I think. But I'm grateful that you're here today. You have so much to offer in the way that you're changing families and lives. And I know today we're going to talk about kind of a term that's familiar with a lot of people, and yet a term that's not familiar with a lot of people. So we're going to talk about codependency and prodependency. And so let's talk a little bit.
Sorry, I'm fixing my look here.
Oh, that's right. You look great. Look at this guy.
Fixing my look.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Okay.
I love it. So what would you say is wrong with this concept or word or thing people do with the codependent nature of life?
Well, I think codependence is a concept, first of all, that doesn't exist in our mental health literature. Despite 35 years, it's never been a diagnosis, not in any of our diagnostic manuals. It doesn't really exist in mental health. It doesn't have an insurance code. So as far as the mental health and addiction community is concerned, it's a concept that's never been validated or put into our formal work. Really, in essence, codependency has always been a pop culture notion that came out of the 1980s and kind of blossomed and exploded and kind of spilled itself all over the addiction field. But I really see it as a way of shaming and devaluing and questioning the very people who love us through the most difficult periods. You know, someone who loves an alcoholic and hangs there with them, and as long as they're not being physically abused, does their best to help that person get well, and doesn't leave that relationship and works toward making it better, that person isn't codependent. That person's a hero. That person shows tremendous strength in being willing to hold on to the love they have in spite of tremendously difficult circumstances. So I don't think codependency really works because it challenges people to question the love that they have for others.
Yeah, and let's talk about kind of the areas that you help people with. You have, like you said, a specialty in sexual addiction arena. So let's talk about maybe how that comes apart in someone's life and how that really affects the whole family system.
Well, when I work with, if I was working with alcoholics or drug addicts or people with maybe even an eating problem, for the spouses and partners, it's kind of easier to understand, my husband or my wife or my loved one has an addiction, because it's very clear they're consuming it, they're paying for it, and it's not nearly as personal. It's much easier to see, let's say, alcoholism as that other person's problem, and I live with them and I'm dealing with that problem. But when it comes to intimate problems like compulsive sexual behavior, porn problems, cheating, infidelity, excuse me, it's very hard from the spouses, because they're in a dilemma. You know, it's like, I love this person, they're clearly ill, and I want to help them and stand by them. But on the other hand, I hate them, and they betrayed me, and they ruined my life, and I don't know if I want to stay with them. And it's different than alcohol and drugs because it's so personal. You cheated on me. And what we call that, by the way, we have a name for that, ambivalent love, where and addicts partners feel this all the time. Like, I love you, we've had a life together, I look at you right now and you're great. And then 5 minutes later, I look at you and I freaking hate you and you ruined my life. And both feelings exist in the same time, which makes partners kind of crazy.
Yeah, it's quite the kind of I think of the hamster cage, right? You're just kind of going and don't know how to get off it. And in the journey of my own world of being in the recovery world and also professionally in the addiction recovery world, I've heard these terms, and maybe you can speak into this, of process addictions versus like a substance abuse addiction? And what's kind of a big difference in those?
Well, there is no difference in terms of what addiction does to the brain. Whether I'm using, and I mean using, intense fantasy and a dissociative focus on what I want to go do, whether that's gambling or sex or gaming, anything in those areas. I am just as addicted to that as some people are to drugs and alcohol, because it's a neurological problem in the brain. I keep returning to a same behavior because it comforts me and soothes me. And it is often not in line with my values and who I want to be and what I believe in, but I return to it over and over again because it's a pattern I established really early in life, a way to cope using fantasy and disappearing. Process addictions basically are all about the process. So it isn't about, in my world, getting on the porn or seeing the sex worker or having the affair. That's the end point. But the person's not just addicted to that. They're addicted to calling, searching online, planning they're high and excited about all of that. They're really not present once they start down that road of pursuing their fantasies to completion. So unlike a drug addict and alcoholic who's truly addicted to the drug itself, my folks are addicted to the whole process. This also applies for people with eating disorders, any non-drug problem where it's the whole process, like gaming, gambling, video games. It's about the whole thing, not just about the end point.
Yeah, it is, and hence the process journey as well. Is it different in this world of sexual addictions and for men and women? Is there a variation, or is it kind of the same?
Well, we know in the regular culture that if you look at men who get in trouble for behaviors, it's often related to sex or violence, the men we put into jail. And that has to do with one thing and one thing only: testosterone. We are more aggressive, more assertive, more able to get angry and act that anger out than a woman might be, because she's not fueled by testosterone, which is a very powerful hormone. Women tend to more act in, not always, but they'll tend to more act in with alcohol, with self-harm, with food, sometimes with relationships. But guys will go straight out there and get violent or screw up with sex in a variety of ways. So men are more likely to act out. Women are more likely to act in, but that's not a universal thing.
Okay.
Oh, and by the way, 30% of my clients are female. And when I go online, by the way, I want to say this, I'm on intherooms.com every Friday night at 5. I'm on sex and relationship healing every Monday. I'm sorry, In the Rooms is at 6, Mondays is at 5, California time. And what I do on these sites is I simply answer questions. I sit for an hour and sit twice a week and do service by answering people's questions about this very uncomfortable, embarrassing, shameful issue.
And that's an important word you mentioned, service. So talk to people more about that. Like, you're in recovery, you're helping people. This term of service, how does that play a role in your own recovery?
Well, I have to say it's kind of a selfish thing, because, in some ways, the idea of service comes from the 12 steps and that whole world, which I very much believe in. And there is an idea that I can't go to self-pity. I can't go to feeling like a victim. I'll be much less entitled about what I want and what I need and me, when I am focused on other people and their needs. Every therapist knows, by the way, that we can be having the worst day in the world, but when we focus on that client, it all goes away. We're there for them. The end of the day may not be so good, but while we're with the clients, we feel okay because we focus on others. I believe that I owe a great debt to recovery, to the 12 steps, to the programs and therapy, because I can walk and chew gum at the same time. Understand, I've been in 12-step programs for 35 years. And I've been an active therapist for 25. And I spent 27 in therapy, 27 years. I bought pools for therapists. But I get to be a whole person. I get to have a real life. I get to be, and the end point of that is I have to give some of it back. I have to pay it forward. And when I was younger and struggling with my addiction, I had heard of people like Pat Carnes or Claudia Black, but I couldn't talk to them. I couldn't reach them. I could maybe see a therapist they trained or go to a lecture or read a book. But you can talk to me anytime, twice a week. And I think that's the miracle of our online world, because for me to give a few hours a week to answer questions, listen, it makes me feel good. I actually have answers. I can help these people, and they're so grateful to have a real answer. So for me, it's just as rewarding for me as it is hopefully for them.
So how have you seen the tools to help families and individuals over the last, 20 plus years change?
Well, we're kind of back to codependency because I think that is a major tool, a major lens through which we have looked at partners and parents and families. And there's a very implied, very clear message within codependency that if you married one of us, if you're committed to one of us, if you're hanging on to one of us and we have an addiction, that there's something wrong with you. Codependency says, what's wrong with you for being with us? We're so screwed up. You must be screwed up too, or you would have left. Or, and by the way, when the codependency also says when you as a spouse, as a partner, get better, realize your own goals and become stronger, you're going to leave that person because unless they've grown, you're not going to want to be with them. And I think that puts an undue burden on the spouses and the partners who I don't think are that troubled. There's this whole message. By the way, I studied codependency. It was my PhD dissertation. So I spent 3 years reading every single thing I could read about codependency, and ultimately is a pop culture notion that kind of exploded all over everyone. And the thing is, we're still carrying it in the addiction world. And what that means is, so when I studied this, there's a guy named William White, and he's the historian for the addiction field. He was at Hazel, all that stuff. And he writes about in the 1940s and 50s, what we would say about the wives of alcoholics. It was something like, if I was married to her, I would drink too. There has always been a negative emphasis on the partners of addicts, like somehow they are causing the problem, creating the problem, contributing the problem, and I don't believe any of that. I think they love us and they would do anything to get us better. Prodependence says, the reason you're hanging out with me is because you love me and you still see the good parts in me. And even though I'm screwing up, you have great hope that if you hang in there long enough and you help, we will get better and love you in the way and be a good family person the way we were before. To me, that's not a bad reason for hanging out. That isn't anything wrong with you. You're hanging out because you're holding on to love. That's a wonderful thing. So I see, when we look, if my wife had cancer and we weren't sure if she was going to get well, I would have a flood of people that came over and they were bringing me casseroles. They would be saying, you're a hero. They'd be trying to give me nights off so I could take care of myself. But if I say I'm married to an opiate addict and it's ruining my life and the outcome is uncertain, everybody looks at me like, oh, well, how did you attract this? How did you get into this? And that's just so awful. Because this person who's a partner or a parent is going through the worst experience in their entire life. The person they most love and appreciate is falling apart. Their family is falling apart. And we could turn to them under codependence and say, now let's look at what's wrong with you. And I can't think of anything more painful for the partners because they already feel like it's their fault. And that's kind of what we're telling them.
That shame is such a huge word.
I told you I could talk a lot.
Yeah, no, I love it. No, I mean, well, shame is such
I told you I could talk a lot.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, shame is such a big term, right? In this world, and I feel like so many programs and people out there can throw that shame upon a family. And so when you brought this term of prodependency to me, several months ago when I interviewed you on the podcast show, I was like, man, that's just brilliant. And so I want to dive into that in pretty good detail to maybe give people an idea of how do we bring this into even recovery programs or treatment centers or therapies. And so how is that becoming a thing with people as they're catching on to what you're talking about?
Well, when I wrote Prodependence and it came out in 2018, it was a book about a concept, a way to look at families and partners through a strength-based lens, supporting them for the love they give rather than questioning why they gave it. And I've seen in my world, you have to understand, in the sex addiction world, if I'm a sex addict and I'm married to someone and I have seen 25 sex workers and had 3 affairs and looked at a porn for 100 nights a year, how could that possibly be my partner's fault? How could they ever have anything to do with that behavior? It clearly doesn't. And so where a lot of this came out of was my field, where sex and love and addiction and betrayal. Because when our partners were told back in the years past, oh, well, you must have some part in this, they would get furious. It's like, how could I possibly have a part? So I began to think, I think they're right. And then I started thinking, but we look at partners of all addicts as having something wrong with them under codependency because they love a broken person. And not only does that make any logical sense to me, because when someone's hurting me, I leave. And I think healthy partners would do that if they didn't love us if they didn't want our families to work. And by the way, I will say this, and I think I said this before, if a partner comes to me of an alcoholic and she says, you know, my husband was drinking during the day and my kids were being taken to school by a drunk dad, and dad lost his job and he got arrested for a DUI. But as his wife, I made a decision. I told him that I would put a cold bottle of vodka on our table at home every night at 4 o'clock, as long as he didn't get drunk before. Now, I know what will be said in codependency, but, oh, you enabled him, you must want him to drink. You know, I just think no partner, no spouse has gone to graduate school to help an addict. Most of you didn't go to college to help an addict. That's my job. So partners are just doing the best they can. Do you know why that woman brings a bottle home at 4 o'clock? Because every single day she's able to get her husband to work, to not get arrested, and to take care of those kids when he drives them home. And that is such a gift to her that she doesn't care if he's drunk at night. When he comes to see me, or they do, is when he can't hold on to drinking anymore and he's starting to drink in the daytime. And then I say to that spouse about bringing the bottles home, that was very clever. What a really brilliant idea to help foster your family's growth. And you got another 2 years out of that guy. I'm proud of you. Rather than saying, why did you bring those bottles home? What's wrong with, I have an assumption that our families and spouses are doing the best they can to love us under extremely difficult circumstances. And all the craziness we see, the nagging, the complaining, that is really just a result of the trauma of living with someone who's falling apart. And no matter what you do, you can't seem to make it better.
And I'm
How's that?
sure, well, great. I'm sure when you mentioned that to the spouse and said, hey, what you did those 2 years probably gave her the permission to just be open and more vulnerable with you, because you created that safe space for her to engage in
Oh,
conversation.
well, okay. So I'm a social worker at heart. That's how I was trained. And we have this saying in social work called be where the client is. If I enter a relationship with a client and they're really angry at their spouse, and I say, oh, don't worry about it, they're a nice person, I'm not being where they are. They're angry, and I need to, as a therapist, say, wow, you're really angry. I can understand. That's how I build that relationship, by being where they are. I never understood why spouses and partners who, for example, I've spent 2 years trying to get my loved one into treatment, and they are finally going to a hospital and getting treatment. And there I am for Family Week. And I think I've done a pretty good job of loving them, helping them, and sticking by them. And I'm still here. And then I go to the first family lecture, and they start to ask me about my childhood, my problems, my issues, as if I created this problem. I didn't create this problem. I'm just living with it. And I'm falling apart because I'm living with it, and I can't make it better. I can't tell. I've watched spouses and partners walk out of treatment on day one because they said, I will never take responsibility for this other person's problem. I'll take responsibility for loving them, for hanging in there with them, for trying to help them in every way I can. But if you tell me that I did that wrong and it came from the wrong place inside of me, I'm out of here. And codependency never really rose to the level of let me try it this way. There are 370 books with the title codependency in them. Which is the right one? Which is the one that therapists should be working? Because we keep writing about this and writing about this concept that came out in 1984. And I think we keep writing about it because it doesn't work. It just doesn't fit the reality of our clients who are hurting and broken and just really need our support.
So do you feel that
right.
like treatment centers? Oh, sorry.
So no, it's okay. And so I'll never stop talking. So what I have happening is partners are reading this book, or they're growing to groups that support this, and they're healing faster. Because when someone's in a crisis, like your loved one's an alcoholic or a drug addict, you don't want to be taught fancy ideas and things. You don't even get that. You just need support and help. You're in a crisis. And this idea that we ask people in a crisis to question themselves, to look at their motives, to examine their childhood, is simply to put on them what they're already afraid of. Maybe I had something to do with this. Maybe I made it happen. And listen, that's great for alcoholics and drug addicts. We would love, and we do, say, oh, if my partner weren't so nagging, enabling, then I would stop using or whatever. And that's such a great excuse for addicts to just put all the problem on their spouses, because we have laid that out for them.
That's great. I think we have a little bit of a delay every now and then in our thing. So when it cuts off, I don't really feel like I'm cutting you off. I think there's a little bit of a delay. So when I go and sit in there, think about like the family member that's listening right now and saying, gosh, I really need to call and get help for my significant other or whatever. How do you encourage, counsel, coach, advise people to say, you know what, here's the first step you can take to go get your loved one help?
Well, that's a tricky one because, I mean, I have to tell you that it is true that what moves people is the fear of a loss of an important relationship. So I worked with gay men for a very long time through the AIDS crisis. And you would think that men who have sexual problems and are acting them out during a health crisis related to sex would be pouring into treatment saying, we want to live. But it was more like cigarettes. It was something off in the distance. But now I'm seeing more gay guys than ever. And the reason is because they're getting married and they're getting in committed relationships and they're not happy with what that partner is doing on the side. Yeah.
Do you see a lot of connection between substance abuse and sexual addictions?
About 50%, maybe 40% of the clients that I see have had a drug and alcohol problem. Most of them, the alcoholics and the drug addicts, mostly come in sober. And the problem is that they have tried, they've worked a really good recovery process around alcohol or drugs, but they don't feel happy, joyous, and free because they still have secrets. They're still living a double life. And then someone they love finds out. And that's when everything falls apart. Because as I was saying, people are not motivated by the fear of consequences, but they're very motivated by the actual consequences, especially when it involves the loss of love. 90% of, well, probably 75% of my referrals are driven by partners who say, I'm not going to put up with this. You're going to lose your kids. You're going to lose your family. I'm not going to live with you doing what you're doing, whatever that is. And if you don't get help, I'm out of here. And it is the loss of relationship that motivates people to get well. I mean, that's a big part of what it is.
Yeah, because there's a lot of that deep love.
So,
Like, I don't want to lose this person.
and I don't have any power over that. I can't tell a spouse to leave or stay, but I know when a spouse is so fed up, or another way to put it is they're so stuck with an inability to help, that's when they need to come to us. And what we might say is you need to distance yourself, not because couples distancing is the healing. I think couples coming together is the healing, but you may just need to distance yourself until this person figures out that until they stop this, they're not going to have you.
So let's talk to the person that is struggling right now with their own sexual addictions and acting out
Okay.
in secrecy. Let's talk to, the person that is just listening and going, man, I know what I'm doing. I maybe should not be doing, and I don't want to do it, but I don't know how to stop. So how can they break out of this? Or I guess talk to about how is this secrecy really destroying them internally?
Well, I think addicts are broken in a way that they're compartmentalized. So I can have this crazy sex life over there where I'm lying and cheating and doing all the stuff I want. And then I can go home to my home life where I feel loved and connected. It's just the two never meet. So that's how the addict is able to tolerate what they do, because on some level they feel entitled to it. They deserve it. Look at all they're doing for their family. And so why don't I get to have this on the side? And then they blame their spouses. Well, my partner is pregnant. She's gained weight. He's not attentive. So I deserve. So there's a lot of a sense of putting it on the house in order for me to feel entitled to go do this. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, but I think more of like the mental torture that they're, again, kind of behind closed doors doing what they're doing at the office. And they know that this is not something like take the spouse completely out of it. They know they're in the middle of what they feel as though they shouldn't be doing, but don't know how to get out of it, and not telling anyone about it. And that secrecy, that hiding can really destroy a person's soul.
Well, let's talk about shame. I just talked to a gentleman and his wife online, and we were talking about his behavior in front of her. Because we all knew about it, but we actually had to talk about it. And he just put his head down. He was crying. He was just a mess. I mean, head on the desk. And I said to him, what's going on with you? And he said, I just hate myself. I'm such an awful person. I've ruined my family. I've ruined my life. And I say to him, well, when you're done with that, let's talk about what's really going on. Because that kind of shame, or what we used to call a shame spiral, is really kind of narcissistic. Because it's all about me. Poor me. No one loves me. Look at all the terrible things I did. It's not like saying, wow, I can't imagine what my kids are going through, or I can't imagine how this has affected my parents. That would be something I would encourage someone to be sad about. But shame really just keeps people bound in secrecy, and also without the ability to really, they're so busy thinking about how others are going to judge them that they stay completely closed down. But in terms of help, There are 12-step meetings for sex addicts, for porn addicts, for love addicts. They're all over the internet. They're live. I run a site called sexandrelationshiphealing.com. It's a nonprofit site. We do nothing on there but give away partners groups, webinars, everything, because I think people need access to. That's another form of service, is I can get some lazy therapists to volunteer to spend 14 or 15 hours a week giving service among the group. And so, you know, on sex and relationship healing, we have a men's addiction group, a women's addiction group, a partner's betrayal, a male and female, you know, all of the places where we can touch couples and individuals with infidelity and cheating. Because like you said, where do I go? I mean, if my spouse is deep, or parent or kid, if they're cheating all the time, do I tell my neighbor? Do I tell my friend? What about Thanksgiving? If I tell my family, I got to face them every year. It's very hard for people. I mean, people will come forward and say, my husband or my wife, my friend is an alcoholic, because we kind of get that in our culture. But when you talk about sexual problems, people immediately go to offending, grabbing my kids. You know, there's no balance in that discussion.
Yeah. And how do you talk about the difference between like shame and guilt?
Well, shame is very useless. As I said, shame is a very self-focused obsession with how horrible I am, and hating myself, and really seeing myself as the worst person in the world. And first of all, that's not true. You're probably a broken person who means well, but needs help. And second of all, that's not productive, because when you go in that place, there's no room for healing. It's like you shut down into a self-hatred. So actually, I get shamed sometimes. And I was in therapy once, and I was deeply ashamed about whatever I did. And my therapist said, you know, that's kind of useless. And I'm like, oh, what do you mean? You know, I'm in so much pain. He's like, well, where are you going to go from there if you just hate yourself? So shame is really, I think, comes a lot out of trauma and abuse in childhood, where a child doesn't learn their self-worth, maybe there's abuse, and there's a lot of shame surrounding them altogether. Guilt is what I want people to get to. Guilt is healthy. You know, if I say to you, Rob, you know, I really hate that shirt. And you're like, oh my God, I spent so much money on this shirt, and my wife loved this shirt, greatest shirt I ever owned. I should feel a little guilty, like, oh, that was important to him, and I let him down. And guilt is an extremely useful emotion, because it doesn't say I'm a bad person. It says I made a mistake. And guilt tells me I can go back and fix that mistake. I can go to Rob and say, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize that was important to you. And, you know, whatever I say. But in shame, there's no place to go. If I'm a bad person, what am I going to do? I'm just a bad person. And addicts will obsessively think about themselves that way, which leaves them kind of trapped.
Well, thanks for clarifying, because I do really like this shirt. So thank you for backing off on that. It was one of my favorite shirts I'm wearing. So if we can, I want to dive in a little bit to, yeah, I want to dive in a little bit to our youth right now. And what are you seeing in the youth in regards to access to phones and sex addiction and exposure?
Well, first of all, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff. First of all, you know, when I ask parents, if you have a kid between like 16 and 18, 15 and 18, do you think they're looking at porn? And, you know, I'm asking an audience of 300 people. And you know what? No one raises their hand. Everyone realizes that our youth is looking at porn. It's an integrated part of their lives. You know, we used to have drinking parties. We used to do all kinds of stuff. I'm not sure that I see it in a whole lot different way. I think it's young people exploring in a new world that we live in. But there are problems. And the problem is with the immediacy of sex, the immediacy of connection, like with app. You don't really have to negotiate a relationship with someone to have sex. And I have to tell you, the idea that I was going to get laid drove a lot of dating in my youth. And in that dating, I learned how to negotiate relationship, how to hold your hand, but not put my hand here because that makes you angry. I learned how to accept people that liked me and people who didn't. But if you're simply hooking up for sex, and this is something I see 23, 24, 25-year-old men who say, you know, my friends are starting to date and get in serious relationships, and I've never had one. In fact, I've never had sex. The porn addicts in particular, a lot of them have been looking at porn since they were 9 or 11, and they didn't really focus on high school or recreation or friends because they were focused on the porn. But then later in life, they don't have a lot of skills to build relationships and intimacy, or even to be a part of a working team. It's just not skills that they learned. And then below that, there are people who are so addicted to porn that they're not sexually or romantically functional at all. In other words, the man who's looking at porn 4 nights a week, and then he tries to date and goes out with someone, he can't get an erection, he can't get aroused, he's not interested because he's been so stimulated by all that porn that just being with a person, well, they smell funny and they don't always want to have sex. And, you know, I don't know how to get along. So they really defer to the porn. And by the way, we don't have a diagnosis for porn addiction or problem porn behavior. We do have one for sex addiction, but we don't have one for porn. And I think that is really a lot of the leading problem with young people.
Do you feel like people give justification to different ranges of, we talk about porn, I think of like watching videos and stuff like that too, versus actually going having sex with someone physically? I feel like there's a wide range there that can, you know, span of, I just look at porn and I'm actually having sex with someone outside of whatever, or just lots of partners.
You know, if you were a wife, you would not say that. Because if I'm married to you and I look at porn regularly and I never tell you about it, I've done research about this. We have documented peer-reviewed studies that talk about the majority of spouses, when they find someone's looking at porn and they didn't know about it, their feeling is, I'm being cheated on. You're comparing me to those other people. You're letting me down. You have this whole secret life that I didn't know about. See, the porn is not the problem. The secrecy is the problem. I just worked with a couple today. The wife said, you know, if you told me about this, that you look at porn regularly and it's part of your life before we got married or when we would have worked it out. But you kept the secret from me for 5 years and I found all this porn. And the big problem with that, actually, I think for the spouses of all addicts, is that you lose trust in us. And trust is the glue that holds relationships together. And addicts, we think that trust is parsable, meaning I was really bad around this area of my life, but in every other of my life, I've been faithful and supportive and loving. But partners don't look at it that way. They say, well, if you lied about this, what else are you lying about? Do I even know who you are? And if it's a sexual lie, then it becomes who you're having affairs with. Do you have another family? Because spouses don't think it's just this. They often think there's so much more. Trust is gone.
So I just had this picture of a one person in a relationship that has just heard this and said, okay, you know what? You're right. I need to go tell my spouse. And they're ready to run through the door and say, hey, babe, hey, honey, guess what? How would you advise them to approach this area of breaking that secrecy to say, hey, I need to confess something to you?
I would say don't. I think that's a really bad idea. I think if you have secrets and you're feeling bad about not having shared them with other people and they don't meet your values, go see a therapist, go to a 12-step meeting, figure out what's wrong with you, and then maybe find an organized and structured way to talk to your spouse. Too many men and women I work with will vomit their reality all over their spouse, you know, just like, here's everything I did. You've been asking, fine, I'll tell you. And that spouse is devastated. But the person who was doing all the acting out kind of feels better, like, oh, that's off my chest. No, I don't have any secrets. I feel so much better. And the spouse just feels like they were hit by a truck. And then the addict looks at them and say, well, this is what you wanted. Why are you so upset? Because they don't realize what that person has just heard. They're feeling a lot better. So don't do that. Don't vomit over your partner with your secrets because it makes you feel better or because they want the answer. Go get some help with your secrets and then approach your partner in a structured, healthy way with help. By the way, Rob, you haven't asked, but I think we should say, what is sex addiction? What is an addiction around sex versus somebody who has affairs, somebody who cheats once in a while, or somebody, you know, whatever it is. And really, you know, I get asked, like, is sex addiction about how much sex you have? You know, is it 5 times a week, 4 times a week? And I'm like, well, we don't really judge alcoholism by drinking 1 drink or 3 drinks or gambling by $100 or $1,000. So I guess we couldn't really judge what a sex addiction is by how often you have sex. And then they say, well, it must be about what kind of sex you have. If you're into this or into that or fetishes. And I'll say, well, but does that mean if you drink whiskey, you're not an alcoholic, but if you drink vodka, you are? Because the flavors don't really matter. And then we get to discuss what addiction is really about. And addiction is not defined quantitatively, it's defined qualitatively, meaning what is the effect of this behavior or drug and alcohol consumption on your functionality? How much is affecting your relationship, your work? What happens with addicts is they get increasingly focused on whatever it is they're doing and decreasingly focused on their families, on their work, on school, and everything starts to suffer. And then they say, oh, well, this is clearly a problem. I need to change this, but they can't. They just can't. So what are the signs of addiction? Out of control behavior. So it's a problem. I'm doing it all the time. loss of control. I know it's a bad idea and I probably should stop and I don't feel good about it, but I can't. And then I continue despite my consequences. My spouse find out, my parents find, I'm in a lot of trouble, but I'll just find a different way to do it that they won't find out, rather than looking at the problem directly. Those signs indicate any kind of addiction, whether it's drugs, alcohol, or a process addiction.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate
Does that work for you?
That's great. Yeah, it's great to talk about that part of it. And again, this is giving people all this clarity, because people are coming to the summit because they don't know what to do in their family unit. The loved one doesn't know like how to break free from this. And I love what you said about don't just go vomit all over your loved one, because like they're not ready for that and you don't even know what the root cause is. So let's find that out first. And I know one of the things
with a
with codependence, yes.
Sorry. Well, using a codependent lens, I can say to that partner who's been cheated on, I know you feel like you're not thin enough, not attractive enough, that somehow, but you know what? Or whatever it is, you're not smart enough, you don't make enough money. But this person was doing it long before they met you. They had this they were broken before they met you, and anyone else they would be with, they would do this too. So I just want every partner of every addiction to understand, as strongly as I can say it, that you, as a loved one, a parent, a partner, are never, ever responsible for someone else's behavior, ever. No matter how bad you feel about it, no how much people tell you enabled. Look, if I have a horrible day and I have a fight with you, I could go talk to a friend, I can go for a walk, I can go for a swim or whatever, or I can cheat on you. It seems like, or drink. The decision to do the unhealthy thing when I'm upset has nothing to do with my spouse. That is always my decision. And part of what I hate about codependency is it leaves this questioning in spouses' heads. Well, if I nag less, if I was kinder, if I wasn't acting out my trauma with them, it wouldn't be like this. And that's not true. The addict is going to be the addict no matter what you do. And this idea that spouses are responsible, that it's the parent's fault, I just don't go for that.
Yeah, well, I know you're offering, and thanks for the clarity there too, that and you're offering people that are coming to the summit, your free webinar that's sex and relationship healing. Can you give people an idea of what they might experience when they go to that webinar and what they're going to learn? I mean, I'm sure a lot what we already talked about.
There are 14 groups a week. So there are 3 different kinds of groups. There are webinars where people can come listen to an expert and they don't have to show their face and they're just listening. And then there's Q&As, like I do once or twice a week, where you can ask me or any of our professionals questions about drugs, alcohol, sex, healing, relationship. All of that is free. And then there are groups that are more sharing, where everybody sees each other, and it's not as private. But there are groups like that for male spouses, for female spouses, for male sex addicts, for female sex addicts, for chem sex addicts, all of it. And I understand that this is such a shameful, difficult world around sex and intimacy that you don't have a lot of places to ask questions or get help. And if you don't, and let me tell you, Rob, I'm a social worker at heart. I know that so many people who need help will never get to a therapist. They may never walk through the doors of a 12-step program. But if we can bring them some peace and some support, and they can just find it without paying for it, that is also a tremendous gift to me.
Wonderful. Well, I love your heart. I love the way you give service and you just want to reach so many people. You're such a giving man that is so...
I'm trying to do that. What's a heart with my hands, but I don't think I can.
There you go. It looks good. There you go. Something like that. So
my heart looks more like my fingers are broken or something. But,
hey, not all hearts are shaped the same, right? So any other encouraging words you want to give our audience today as we kind of start wrapping up a little bit?
Well, I run a treatment program, and let me say something about that. We treat men who have intimacy and sexual problems like this, compulsive, addictive, cheating, infidelity, in a serial way. And we also treat men who have problems with drugs and sex. I've worked in many, many drug and alcohol centers where the person had a lot of sexual problems and nobody wants to talk about it. And the problem is often that's the sexual problems are why that person was drinking and using. So I can teach someone how to not use meth, how to not drink, but what is driving that? For most people who put sex and drugs and alcohol together, they have sexual problems. And so when they go to a regular treatment center, some of them are great, some of them are awful, but the reality is they're not going to talk about the thing that underlies their problem. Because if you're sitting in a group of alcoholics, you're not going to say, well, I'm masturbating 3 times a week to porn and having affairs. You're just not. And so how do you find a place where you can look at the trauma and the underlying issues? That's what we tried to create at Seeking Integrity. And by the way, anyone can write me a note. I am rob@seekingintegrity.com. I will be glad to give you resources, references. I don't get kickbacks, but I know some of the good therapists around the country. I also have a podcast. You know about this. So we're not in competition at all. We're almost at 500,000 downloads. And we just made the top 100, well, actually the top 50 under health and fitness, both globally and in the United States. So we're doing really well. And I have an amazing group of therapists like Sue Johnson and Stan Katkin and Harville Hendricks and Pat Love and a whole bunch of people who gave of their time to sit with me and explain how the world works in addiction, how it works in healing relationships, how it works in terms of what a relationship should be versus how we live them. So the podcast is Sex, Love, and Addiction. And if you want to learn more about treatment, it's seekingintegrity.com.
Beautiful. Tons of resources you guys did. Not only take use for your family, but please share this interview, share this video. People need to hear about this. That's why we did the Art of Intervention Project Summit, to give you tools to help not only your family, but other ones too. So, hey, Dr. Rob, as you said earlier, you like Dr. Rob. I like that. You know, I don't have a doctor in front of my name. I'm just Rob.
I earned that title.
Yeah, you did. And you have earned it, and you're using it to change lives. So thanks for your time today. We really appreciate you being a part of the summit.
You know, I really admire the work you're doing, and I appreciate any time I get to talk, because we are helping people, and that's what it's all about. Yeah. Thank you, Rob.
You got it. Bye-bye.
Nice shirt.
Thank you.
Nice shirt. Bye for now.